and happy Saturday to you all. My name is Sherry Marlin. I'm with the Water Center for Systems Thinking. I'm joined by several colleagues this morning who will be here to learn and to share with us. And most importantly, we are joined by one of our associates, Maria Simpson. Maria Simpson is a teacher in Winston, Salem, North Carolina. She has been an educator for 17 years, 12 years in Winston-Salem, and it was about 11 years ago that we had the privilege to meet Maria. And at the Water Center in our work with schools and educators, we get to meet a lot of teachers, and some of them just stand out personally and professionally for being outstanding people, outstanding educators, and Maria is certainly one of those. So I can assure you that though you have taken your Saturday morning, like many teachers do, to improve your practice and improve your professional repertoire, you will not be disappointed for this hour that you spend. Maria is a phenomenal educator and has so much to share with us today. So I want to turn it over to her quickly here. We are going to do a little check-in just to let you get to know each other just a little bit, to open up, to make sure that we have some dialogue and some conversation happening. So we're going to ask you to go into a small group, to introduce yourself, and to just talk a little bit about your most memorable science lesson or science experience that you've had. I'm going to leave that really open-ended. So an introduction, most memorable science lesson that you've had, and we will be back here in 7 minutes to hear from Maria and get some great ideas about science education and systems thinking. Now, my guess is that it is Saturday morning, so people may join your groups as we go through, so please be prepared to welcome them in and to have them share with you just a little bit about their thinking about science education. So on that note, I'm going to just hang on half a second. All right, there we go. I think I have those breakout rooms ready to go. We'll see you back in about 7 minutes. Welcome back. Thank you, everyone. All right, I think we are all back together. So again, without further ado, if some themes emerged about those science experiences, I didn't get to share, so I'm going to put mine in, but if some themes emerged, just jot a word in the chat, and Maria's going to share her screen and tell us all about seasons, salmon, storms, systems thinking in science.
Well, I will, since I don't see a whole lot in the chat right now, I'll just say, kind of summarizing what Tracy said at the end of our chat, that a lot of our stories were from the perspective of teaching, and things that we've done with our students, which mainly involved making science hands-on and memorable and being connected to nature, which I love because I think we're going to talk about some of that today. But if anybody has anything else to share, please pop it in the chat. So I'd like to start today, first of all, by saying that my position now at my elementary school is that of a science specialist. I teach kindergarten through 5th grade. I see each class once a week. Of course, right now it's crazy because of COVID and we're not all back in the building, but my main goal is to support the classroom teachers who are also teaching science in the classroom, but to make sure that the students have access to those hands-on experiences. And I love to bring in systems thinking when I'm teaching lessons as well. So I wanted to start by sharing a wonderful resource for anyone who teaches science. The books are Uncovering Student Ideas in Science by Paige Keeley. And this probe, they are full of probes for earth science, life science, and physical science that really get kids thinking and analyzing and proving their thoughts and their theories. So this probe is called, Is It a System? So I'd like for you to just take a moment to glance over the list here. And it says put an X in front of the things that can be thought of as a system. And then you would also encourage the students to explain their thinking and how did they decide whether something would be considered a system. So take a moment to look over those and then we'll discuss it. Would anyone like to share something in that list that they think is not a system? Because you've probably realized that most of those things are a system.
Yes, I can say one thing. So just from the start. So I suppose a pile of sand would not be considered a system.
The pile of sand, right? Because if you take away a scoop full of sand, it's still going to be a pile of sand. And the parts are not really interacting and depending on each other. Exactly right. And the other one that's not a system is the box of nails. But everything else on that list is a system. And of course, you know, if I'm sure you would all have an explanation for why you chose that. But for example, in the aquarium, you have the water and you have the soil or the rocks, and you have the different kinds of fish, and you have the bacteria, and they all affect each other, and so on and so forth. So that's a great resource, those books, Uncovering Students' Ideas in Science, and I thought that would just get us thinking about what is a system. And I'm going to share with you today 3 different lessons that I've done with my students, a kindergarten lesson, a 2nd grade, and a 5th grade lesson. But you will probably see that they can be adapted for different grade levels. And I hope that you're able to, even if you don't teach these particular topics or work with students who are learning these scientific topics, that you will be able to think of a way that you can apply it to your own work. So first of all, this is a book, The Seasons of Arnold's Apple Tree by Gail Gibbons. And most of you have probably heard of her. She's written so many wonderful nonfiction books. And I use this book with my kindergartners when teaching about weather and the seasons. And so I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures from the book that I would share with the children. And so this follows a tree all throughout the different seasons. This is the tree in the spring. And then we see the tree in summer. And it says, Arnold's apple tree has big green leaves that rustle in the wind. And also in the summer, it says, Arnold watches small apples begin to grow. And they grow bigger and bigger. And then we arrive in fall. And in the fall, it says, you know, the leaves are falling and he gathers some and brings them in. And then he shakes the branches and the red apples fall. And then lastly, winter, in which it says the branches of Arnold's apple tree are bare. So with this story, we create a behavior over time graph. And so a behavior over time graph is showing something that's changing over time. And you probably guessed that one of the things that we graph are the leaves on the tree. So this is an example of what behavior over time graph the students might create. And we're doing this as a class because as kindergarten, you know, this is an introduction into systems thinking. So I make it even more fun. Students love behavior over time graphs, but I make it even more fun by, you know, using these cute little leaf die cuts and, you know, sticking them up on the whiteboard, and they get to help draw the line. This one I drew, so, you know, it's nice and neat, but when the kids do it, they love to get involved and do that. And so this is the graph that we would come up with together, that in the spring there are some leaves, and in the summer there are a lot. And then the fall, there are a decrease in leaves because some of the leaves are falling down. And then in the winter, it said that the tree was bare. So there are no leaves on the tree in the winter. And you probably guessed that the other thing that we graph are the apples on Arnold's apple tree. And so again, we go back and we use the text, and we find evidence for our answers. So in the spring, there are no apples yet, they're just blossoms. In the summer, there are some apples, because you remember it said the apples are small and they grow bigger and bigger. And then in the fall, there are a lot of apples, and that's when he harvests them, and he shakes the tree and they fall down. And in the winter, the tree is bare. So the students have a lot of fun with this lesson, and we compare those two graphs next to each other. And I asked the students how they are alike and different. And so I'd like to just ask you to think like a kindergartner. What do you think they notice about the graphs? Would anyone like to share?
Yes, I can also say something. So if
you,
I may
Anna.
just, yeah, perhaps just noticing, well, that the leaves perhaps come first and the apples only later.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Anna. The leaves first and then the apples. Joan, what were you going to say?
I was going to say what Tracy put in the chat, that, you know, from a kindergartner's point of view, that both lines go up and then they go down.
Exactly. And they love to tell you what shape the line has. So they might say that they're both shaped like a mountain or something like that. They might even refer to how steep the line is. But yes, that they both go up and go down. I'm sorry I hadn't been able to see that in the chat. And then they might notice some similarities too, that in the winter the tree is bare, so that it has neither leaves nor apples. So that's my example of a behavior over time graph with kindergartners. Now I'd like for you to think about your own curriculum. Where do you see a change over time? And if you have a scrap sheet of paper nearby, I'd love for you to take a couple minutes to think about it and sketch a quick, simple, you can see how simple they can be, sketch a behavior over time graph, and think about some way you might use one in your curriculum.
Does it have to be science, Maria?
It doesn't have to be science, no. And again, I'd love to see one or two examples, or 3 or 4.
Maria, I'm having difficulty thinking about the time on the X line. I want to graph phase transition of water, solid, liquid, and gas on the y-axis. So what would I put for time on the x-axis?
Well, if you know, we were in our breakout group together, and you remember Tracy's experiment that she was talking about with melting the ice cube, they would have probably calculated that in minutes or hours, maybe. So it kind of depends on, you know, if you're doing a particular experiment, you know, that you're timing, how long does it take, like Tracy's example, how long does it take an ice cube to melt in the sun versus the shade versus indoors? And that could be in minutes or hours probably. But
because I used all 3, solid, liquid, and gas, to show them the differences in the phase transition. So would you suggest me making a graph for each one? Like make a graph for the solid ice cube, another one, well, for water it was just there, right? They could touch it and see it. But with gas, there was a change from water to gas. for the water vapor.
I would put them on the same graph. I'm
Oh,
kind of,
okay.
well, and on your y-axis, and please,
No.
experts chime in, but I would put on the y-axis your solid, liquid, and gas.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I'm kind of thinking, and I know this isn't the exact experiment you did, but for example, putting an ice cube in a pot and then putting that pot on a burner and then measuring how long in minutes it takes to become liquid, and then continuing to measure how long it takes to become gas and evaporate. That's just kind of what I'm thinking. Sherry, do you have any?
Okay.
And there's a question in the chat space also. You see that, Sherry?
I was just actually typing answer. I see that unit is time, or like Maria's talking minutes. So I think you could use a common minute, and then so minutes is going to be your unit across the X, and then the state of matter is the variable. So that's solid, liquid, gas on it, and that you can arrange, and that even would be an interesting conversation to have with the children about how they need to arrange solid, liquid, gas on the y-axis, what makes the most sense, why. Listening to their reasoning about that could give you quite a bit of information about what they understand about the transition and the science of it.
And the x-axis makes an interesting conversation with students.
Okay.
Because if some students think, oh, the unit on the x-axis should be hours, and some students think it should be seconds, and some students think it should be minutes, that's an interesting conversation to open up to the students as well. What do they think the time unit should be on the x-axis is important decision-making for the students.
That's nice. Yeah, thank you.
Maria,
I will say, Anna, there are lots of times where if your units are the same, like sometimes for the Y in a completely different thing, we might have short, medium, tall, or a small, a lot big, or degrees, where and the things that you are graphing are different. Putting multiple lines on one graph can also give children opportunity to look at similarities and differences, and can foster a lot of conversation. So your idea is very powerful, that you could definitely put two lines, tell two stories. You could actually almost do the apples and the leaves on one line for older children, so they could see and articulate those similarities and differences.
On one line, Sherry, or one graph?
One graph.
Graph. You said one line, but I thought you meant one graph.
I did.
I don't know if you can see this. I drew what you just described, Sherry, and there's some inaccuracies in it because I did it really quickly. I don't know if you can see.
Can't see it at all with your background.
This is ice, you know, where it's in solid and kind of semi-solid and liquid, and then fully liquid at the bottom. And the experiment is in 3 different settings. How does ice change when it's in the sun, when it's in the shade versus inside?
We're not seeing it, Tracy. Move it closer to your face. Hold it closer to your body, Tracy, right in front of your body.
There we go.
Or just turn off your background would be best.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay. Because now you've really got us curious, but we can't see it. It's all blue.
Oh, wait a second. Oh. Well, here, can you see?
Yeah. Oh.
No.
And I've got an actual picture of this from a classroom where it is student work. I'm going to try to find it by the end, and then I'll even see if I can put it in the chat as a file. Okay.
Because Maria, we should let you go on, or we're not going to get to see your video.
I know. We better move on. So real quick, we're going to do this after each activity. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with the habits, but if you take a quick glance, it probably stands out to you real quick, the main habit that we're talking about in this lesson. But I'd like for you to type it into the chat, but don't hit enter until I say go. So what what habits, and it could be more than one, could you connect in this lesson? So type it in the chat. And if you've got an answer plugged in, go hit enter. And then we'll see what people thought. Yep, change over time, absolutely. That's the main. Awesome. Okay, so keep that in mind. We'll ask that same question with the next lesson idea. So let's move on. This is a lesson that I've done with my second graders who study life cycles. And I use this book to teach about the life cycle of salmon. So we don't have a ton of time. I'm obviously not going to read the book, but I just want to read a couple of sentences so that you can hear the language that the author David Suzuki uses in this book. Kate and her dad are exploring the river together, and she says, "Ooh, the water's cold." And Dad says, "That's good for the salmon eggs. They need cool water." You know what's really cool? Kate looks up into the trees and she says, "Shade?" He says, "That's it. The forest is like a hat for the river, blocking the sun and keeping the river cool. That's one reason salmon need the forest. Another reason is the roots of the trees hold the soil in place so it doesn't wash into the water and make it dirty. The eggs need clean water, and so do the baby salmon after they hatch." So you can already hear we're talking about how the salmon need the forest. I want to read you a sentence or two on this page. After a fish dies, the body is eaten by tiny bacteria and fungi, which are then eaten by insects. When the baby salmon hatch, they eat those bacteria and insects, which have been fed by their parents' bodies. So by dying, the parents have helped feed their babies. And then Kate says, and I love this, "Bugs eat salmon, salmon eat bugs, another merry-go-round," says Kate. And I love that they call it in this book a merry-go-round. And of course, we're talking about feedback loops. And the last excerpt I want to share with you, Kate and Dad watch a bear carry the salmon away. "Bears like to eat alone," says Dad, "so that bear will take its fish into the forest and eat the yummiest parts, like the brain and belly. Then it will probably leave the rest of the fish and come back to catch more. As the fish rots, the nutrients from its body go into the soil. In that way, the salmon fertilizes the forest." So that connects the other feedback loop, because we had already read about how the salmon need the trees, and now we see how the salmon feed the forest, which is just so cool. This is David Suzuki, and I want to share with you this video clip, and I might not go through the whole thing. It's 5 minutes. It's so interesting, and I just want you to hear some of what he says. This I wouldn't use with my second graders, but I might use it with my middle or high school students if I taught that. So again, I just want you to hear and start listening for some of those connections and those feedback loops.
One of the most rare and endangered ecosystems on the planet are temperate rainforests. North America has half of all temperate rainforests in the world. It's less than 1% of the land, the terrestrial area of the planet. And in North America, we have pinched between the Pacific Ocean and the coastal mountains. We have a temperate rainforest that runs from southern Alaska to northern California. Has the highest biomass, weight of living things, of any ecosystem on the planet. And that's because we have big trees. And one of the mysteries has always been, how can we get such big trees when it rains a lot? It's a rainforest, and the rain washes a lot of the nutrients out of the soil. The soil, in fact, is very poor in nitrogen. So how can you have a nitrogen-poor ecosystem and yet these gigantic trees that are built on nitrogen and carbon? Well, it turns out the secret is the salmon. You see, the salmon are born in the forest. in freshwater rivers. And we know that the salmon need the forest because if you clear cut a watershed where the salmon spawn, salmon populations plummet and usually disappear. The salmon need the forest for the canopy to keep the waters cool because the babies are very sensitive to temperature. We need the forest to provide the feed when the babies are getting ready to go down to the ocean. They need the feed. And we need the forest to hold the soil so that it doesn't spoil the spawning gravel. So we knew that. But now the interesting thing is, if you look at the nitrogen on the land, it's almost exclusively nitrogen 14, which is the normal isotope of nitrogen. When you look in the oceans, the nitrogen also has a large component of nitrogen 15, which is slightly heavier. It's got an extra neutron in it, and you can tell nitrogen 15 from nitrogen 14 in your instruments. So, baby salmon born in the forest, protected by the forest, they go out to sea. There are 5 species of salmon on the coast, and depending on the species, they stay out to sea for 2 to 5 years, all the while growing and loading up with nitrogen 15 from the oceans. So when they come back to spawn, they are loaded like little bullets of nitrogen 15 fertilizer. And as they come into the estuaries, as the killer whales and the seals are eating them, then they hit the river, and the eagles and the whale and the bears and the wolves are all eating the salmon. And as they poop in the woods, they're spreading nitrogen 15 throughout the forest. And one of the major vectors are bears. The bears, they'll fish together. They're a solitary animal. But when the salmon are running, they'll fish together in the same pool. But the minute they grab one, they take off. They don't want to eat it with the other bears around. And they'll go up to 150 meters on either side of the river. They sit down, they eat the best parts, which you all know is the brains and the belly and the eggs. And usually they'll leave the rest of the carcass. So about half the salmon is left there. They go back for another one. And a bear will take about 600 salmon out of the river in a year. And that salmon carcass that's left is immediately pounced on by salamanders and beetles and ravens and everything. But the major vector is flies. So the flies lay their eggs on the carcass. Within a few days, that carcass will be just a seething mass of maggots, which are consuming that flesh, loading up with nitrogen 15. And then they drop to the forest floor and overwinter as pupae. And the next spring, as they hatch, in the trillions, it's just at the time that the birds from South America are coming through on their way to the Arctic to have their babies. So the timing is that the salmon are now feeding the flies, which are programmed then to hatch just at the time that they will feed the birds from South America. When you look at the trees, you can take a core of the trees and pull it out. You can show there are fat rings, which is a lot of growth, or skinny rings. You can measure the amount of nitrogen 15 in the rings and show when there's a fat ring, there's way more nitrogen 15. And then we've got government records going back 50 years, and you can show when there's a fat ring, that was the year there was a big run of salmon. So it's very, very clear the salmon are the major pulse of fertilizer that the trees are getting. The trees respond to that. Many of the
And I'm going to pause there just because of our time, but I think Sherry, you're going to put the link in the chat if anybody wants to check it out. So thank you. So I would love to hear from you all based on the book Salmon Forest and David Suzuki's video clip that we just watched part of. What systems thinking tools would you use with your students if you were teaching this lesson? You probably thought you can use a lot with that, but I thought behavior over time graphs, yes. Connection circles, yes. Feedback loops, yes. Stock and flow. So we're going to talk about some of those real quick. This is my work. I was doing the drawing and kind of modeling for my students. Again, my second graders were not well versed yet in connection circles. So I was, and plus we're doing distance learning right now. So I don't have the kids right there in front of me, but this is just a picture of a connection circle I made with the book Salmon Forest. And I'm not going to take time to talk through all of the connections because they're so numerous, but I did want to mention one of the ones, which is the population of adult salmon is connected to so many things, but it's connected to the bears. And then what do the bears do? The bears poop, and the poop improves the soil quality. And the soil quality, rich with nitrogen, improves the health of the forest. And the health of the forest helps to regulate that river temperature and keep it cool. And the river temperature helps increase the number of salmon eggs because they like to stay at that cool temperature. And then if we have a lot of salmon eggs, then we're going to have a lot of baby salmon that year. And that's just one connection that you can pull out of this connection circle. And you can see that it reaches in many, many more directions. I know that when Joan was teaching me how to use connection circles, she would always ask, you know, where do you see the most activity in the connection circle? And where do you think the leverage is? And of course, the most activity we see is kind of here with our adult salmon and with the baby salmon. And so those are both leverage points, but also the health of the forest. Because if we don't have a healthy forest with the shading the river and keeping the river clean because of less erosion, then that's going to affect the salmon population as well. So the activity that we're going to do together to stretch our brains a little bit today, because I know it stretches mine, is we're going to work together on creating a stock flow map to go along with this same topic. So with stock and flow, and I sometimes when I teach stock and flow, especially the first few times, I'll pull out a beverage dispenser and show students that salmon is our stock. So we'll fill it up with a certain amount of water to represent our salmon. And we'll say that this is our inflow, okay, filling it up. And this is our outflow, and I'll let some of the water run out. So this is our outflow, just to get students kind of understanding what this stock and flow map is demonstrating. So let's work together. I want to hear your ideas about what is increasing and helping the salmon population, and then what are the things that are decreasing the salmon population. And Sherry, you're going to help us annotate. Okay. So I would love to hear your ideas, friends. What did you hear in the book or in the video that might increase or decrease the number of salmon? And you can just shout it out if you want to. I don't have to call on you.
The temperature of the water.
Yes. Thank you, Christine. And Anna said bears decreasing in the outflow, bears eating the salmon.
Yeah, it's, clarity of water, or yeah, and
yes, the clear, clean water, absolutely.
And then providing food for, and then decomposition for the trees, and then creating the flies for the food for the birds.
Mm-hmm. And also, and I don't think I read this section from the book Salmon Forest, but also when the parents' bodies decompose in the river, because, you know, after salmon spawn, the adults die. So if they're not, you know, eaten by bears and eagles and whatnot, they decompose in the river, and then the bacteria and insects feed on them in the river. And then that's what the baby salmon feed on when they hatch. So the dead parents, they're feeding the babies as well as feeding the forest and feeding all of the other animals. I know that's a lot, Sherry. We're
So
making.
even with Alan, like where can you, so trees, and this is a great point. So we can connection in a stock flow, we can highlight, like we want to make the most direct connections. So can you tell me your story again, Alan, kind of in the sequence you'd like to see it on the stock flow map?
Oh, so the inflow of, so water temperature. So what creates the salmon, and then what, and then.
Well, you talked about, so you talked about trees, you talked about bacteria and the insects and the flies.
He mentioned decomposition.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know what else is there. And as you mentioned, the salmon feed the other salmon. They're also and one thing about this too, it just reminds it just so, because I'm up in Vancouver Island, so, and there's this push to go and cut down the rest of the old growth forest up here, and just not just what damage they can do. When I look at this ecosystem, I think of the economics are also tied into it. When you, all of this, right? It's like its own ecological economic system, in a sense. And anyway, sorry, side note.
That's a great connection.
And
Well, Joan, I have
don't
a
know.
follow-up. I have a follow-up. Joan is like the stock flow expert. A follow-up question about that, because on a stock flow, we also have boundaries, right?
Uh-huh.
So the economics of it would probably be another stock maybe that would connect, or.
Well, and what Alan has done here is he's brought in a very viable topic to salmon and logging, etc., but not one that I don't think it's in the book, your salmon book that you read to the children, because I'm familiar with that. And so, as Maria points out, those little cloud figures on either end of the inflow and the outflow line say, yes, there's more in this system, but those clouds represent we're only going to stay within certain boundaries. And the economic aspects of logging and the salmon industry, et cetera, are definitely part of the bigger system, but Maria is not going to put them in this particular stock flow map because they weren't part of the book and Suzuki's video, etc. And so if any of the students' current knowledge brings in economics, the economics of the situation, that's what she would say. You're right. That is a part of the bigger picture, but we're not going to map that right now, is what she would explain.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the decomposition, Sherry has been, we've given her a little time to map while we were talking, and she has said, okay, decomposition would lead to bacteria, insects would lead to bacteria. Now, Maria, I would like you to ask the $1 million question.
Okay, let's see if I get this right. I wrote it down.
All right.
Does the stock, so our stock of salmon, affect any other part of the system? So in other words, and this is how I would ask it to my second graders and how I would ask it to me, can we draw an arrow from our stock of salmon either into one of the connectors that goes into the inflow or the outflow? Where do you see a connection there?
Or to converters,
Converters,
the amount of salmon that you have go out and affect water temperature or decomposition or clean water or bears. Does the amount of salmon you have affect the amount of bears that whoa. Sherry wanted to make a statement there, didn't she? Hello.
I think Suzuki made that. We saw that in the video. That one seemed clear.
Yeah.
But trees are out there. Do we want to say bears? That, that's pretty basic predator More salmon, more bears.
And
More
Anna
bears,
has,
less salmon.
and Anna has an answer in the chat. Anna says the more salmon, the more inflow, that she sees a reinforcing loop there, that the more salmon that there's going to be, the more salmon you have, the more salmon you're going to get. So a basic birth population dynamic.
And Christy said the trees,
Sure.
that the salmon increased the trees as well, since Suzuki mentioned in the video the growth in the tree rings, that you can measure that. Those are some great ideas. I love the conversation that comes from just each and every one of the systems thinking tools.
And
I'm going to go ahead.
Maria, can I ask, we're having this conversation as adults. Could you speak to the conversation with your, and I've seen you have these conversations with your second graders as you're doing stock flow. Could you speak to that, please?
Yes, and I mean, the students, they blow you away sometimes with the things that they notice. But you might have to get them kind of started and point them towards, you know, some of the specifics from the text or whatnot. But then they just come at you with their ideas, and then you might just have to fine tune them a little bit, just like we are doing now with each other. And just like I do with myself, this slide is the top picture is a stock flow that I sketched last year when I taught this lesson. And I went back and looked at my plans, and I was thinking about it again. And I decided to change my vocabulary a little bit, and also look for those feedback loops from the stock of salmon, and how the stock of salmon goes out to influence the something else in the system. So you can see just how over time my own work changes and hopefully improves, just with opportunity to talk to the students, talk to my colleagues, and whatnot. So I think that what we created today was awesome, and kind of mirrors what we see here. So I'm glad our thinking is all on the right track. I'm going to move on to our habits cards, and this time I bet you're seeing a lot of different habits that we've talked about. So again, I want you to glance at the habits cards, type in one or two that you think connect to this lesson, and then wait till I say go to hit enter, and we'll see what people populate. All right, if you hit enter, let's see a waterfall of ideas. Awesome. So changes perspective. Anna said circular nature of cause and effect, accumulations and rates of change, and circular causality, those feedback loops, circular nature of cause and effect relationships, accumulations and rates of change, that was our stock and flow, time delay, which we talked about with the logging and how that can affect things down the line, meaningful connections. Yes, I think yeah, considers consequences was another one I had said, because of, you know, considering the logging and that sort of thing, and those economics and whatnot. Yes, awesome.
And Anna's comment about many of the habits are connected.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why you get so many different answers.
Right, exactly right. Okay, so I'm going to be real brief on our last lesson because I want to give a little time for Sherry to wrap us up at the end. This lesson is a lesson that I teach to my 5th graders about El Nino. And you can probably imagine how very interesting and riveted they are by El Nino. I mean, they could care less. So I have to try and find a way to make it fun and get them to understand just what a big phenomenon El Nino is. So I do have a book that I pull just a little bit of text from. I'm not going to take time to read it to you today. Basically, El Nino is a weather phenomenon that affects at least half the world. It takes place in the Pacific Ocean. Usually the trade winds are blowing from west to east, those strong trade winds, but in an El Nino year, those trade winds weaken. And so you have a buildup of warmer water off the west coast of America and South America. And then you have cooler water off the coast of Asia. So what does that affect? We're not going to take the time to watch these two video clips, but I know Sherry will put them in the chat in case you happen to need to teach El Nino to your students. In this first video clip, and it's from the 2015-16 El Nino year, which is the last year that we had a significant El Nino. It talks about the effects in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, where because of that cooler ocean water, they had less rain because, you know, warmer ocean water would evaporate and then create the conditions for rain. And you can imagine in Indonesia, they're growing lots of rice and they need a lot of rain. So during an El Nino year in Indonesia, they can experience drought, and that's going to lead to decreased rice production, which is going to lead to increased food prices and lots of other things. They also have a lot of fires during El Nino years because of the dry land and because farmers are trying to clear their land for other crops like palm trees. So those are some of the effects in Indonesia. Then we have very different effects in California and the West Coast, and of course South America as well, where we have a lot of rain and flooding and landslides. And so we're talking about, you know, destruction of property and all of that sort of stuff. And really the only good thing is that increases the groundwater, which they are probably lacking in because they probably experienced a La Nina year a few years prior where they're experiencing drought. So you can see that the effects of El Nino are widespread and also connected. And so the tool that I use for this lesson is another connection circle. And you probably noticed a couple of different things about this one compared to the Salmon one. And this one, I actually put both the Indonesian effects and the effects in California on the same map. I just used two different colors. And I also used my pluses and minuses on this map, whereas I didn't with my second graders. My fifth graders are a little more advanced with using connection circles. So where you see a minus, that's an inverse relationship, an opposite relationship. And then where you see a plus, you have either both going up or both going down. So just to walk through a couple of the connections, the strengths of the trade winds. As the trade winds decrease, we have a stronger El Nino. And then in Indonesia, that would mean less rain, which would mean more drought, which would mean less of a rice crop, which would mean the farmer's cost goes up, which means since there's less of a rice crop, they might have to clear their land, which means there would be an increase in fires and so on and so forth. And I did the same thing, but in a different color for California, where we have, because of an El Nino, we have more rain, which does increase the groundwater, but also increases flooding, which increases mudslides, which increases property damage, and so on and so forth. So that is my connection circle for El Nino. And I'm sorry to rush through that so quickly, but I did just want to kind of show you how I use those video clips and how we talk about it. Again, this is one that I drew, but I have the kids do it with me. And I want to hear their ideas, and I let them tell me the connections that they see. And this is just really a behavior over time graph that I found about El Nino and La Nina. And if you live over on the West Coast and my Arizona ladies, y'all probably have a lot more experience with this. We're headed into a La Nina. You can see right here, they're predicting that for the 2020-2021 season. So that could mean more drought. And I'm sorry, ladies. During a La Nina year, it usually means there's less rain because El Nino and La Nina basically have the opposite effects.
I was thinking when you said your students aren't very interested, I was thinking that's because you live
In North
someplace
Carolina.
on the west, in the west.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they say that we do get effects from El Nino, more hurricanes and whatnot those years, but it doesn't affect us quite as strongly. And so since we are running short on time, we'll go ahead and talk about our waterfall chat for this one. So again, where did you see the habits in that lesson? And if you want to go ahead and type into the chat. And hit go whenever you're ready, hit enter. And so I see meaningful connections, change over time, connections, circular nature, leverage actions, circular causality, accumulations, considers issues. And the challenging thing for scientists is that we know that El Niños happen usually every 3 to 7 years, but other than that, there's not a really great way to predict when it happens or anything that we can really do to stop it. It's been happening for hundreds of years. And I said those main things as well: cause and effect, meaningful connections, change over time. Yeah. Thank you so much for participating. And Sherry, do you want to wrap us up?
I will. Thank you, Maria, so much. Such great ideas. And Maria's really illustrated exactly what I wanted to say in this slide, that the connections between systems thinking and science, and really being able to use science as a way to deepen students' critical thinking and problem solving and their ability to think and reason. It's a beautiful marriage of those things. This is just a little graphic organizer of the next gen science standards that are modified, used in most states here in the US and modified in others. But they are replete with systems connections, and there is language. Just as you look at those science and engineering practices, the analyzing and interpreting data, and Maria showed us so clearly how young children can begin to use and apply this data, and then how that prepares them as they matriculate through these standards. And then the cross-cutting concepts look kind of like a copy of the habits in some ways. The patterns, the cause and effect, the things that you've been entering in your waterfall, you can see those in those standards. So we look forward at the Water Center to having ongoing conversations with teachers really interested in some of these meaningful connections between the standards and science, and how the systems, habits, and tools can really help make those things happen in classrooms. So Maria, if you will, we are at time. So if you'll just go forward, we would encourage you. You're now registered for TTS, having signed up for Thinking Tool Studio. Many of you have been with us regularly, and we appreciate that. The next Open Studio will be Thursday, December 3rd. Even if you're teaching, if you can sneak away, there are going to be some exciting end of the year treats and surprises in that Open Studio. You won't want to miss it. And then we'll have Teacher Studio again on December 5th. So those registrations will go up shortly. You will receive a survey so you can give us some feedback about this session today and how we can better serve you and your colleagues as you do this very important work of educating children. So thank you. Go have a wonderful Saturday, and we look forward to hosting you again in Teacher Studio.
Sherry, I recommend that people share their chat. There are some links in there that people may want. And I put a link into a specific lesson plan in the TTS resources section, which is by one of our kindergarten teacher colleagues like Maria. She's one of our associates, and she did a lesson plan on using stocks and flows with kindergartners, so with 6-year-olds. And within that lesson plan, she wrote out direction steps on how to do stocks and flows. And it's written out beautifully on how you would start using stocks and flows with little people. So there's a link to that lesson plan.
See that? Save that chat. Thank you, Joan. Thank you so much.
Okay, and you save the chat by using the 3 little dots, that little box down in the chat space.
And I also put that picture of that melting ice behavior over time graph. I dumped that in there as well. So.
Okay, save your chat. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Maria. Fantastic as always, babe.
Thank you so much for joining, everybody. I had fun.